thunderous roar of cannons, the sharp snap of musketry tear through the humid air as steel-edged cutlasses clash with razor-sharp bayonets, slicing through the thick air and overgrown vegetation of the primordial jungle. Punctuating this furious fight for survival are the deep, bone-shaking rings of war gongs that echo from the jungle's edge, adding an element of horror that would force weaker men than these to quail and flee. But they do not. These are heroes. British soldiers stand shoulder to shoulder with Dayak warriors in the sweltering heat, the boots of these sailors sinking into the muck along the slow, tea-colored river. They struggle to batter through massive ironwood booms, lethal river traps, while brass Laylas spit fire from the banks, and poison-tipped darts hiss through the green foliage of the endless canopy, searching for a fleshy gap in a blue jacket. Suddenly, menace slams through the log-studded barrier, unleashing a devastating storm upon the pirates. Lead screams through the air, plowing into the primeval growth that blankets this wild tropical frontier and its ruthless defenders. In the center of the smoke, a hero emerges. Sword in one hand, pistol in the other, with the epauletted Captain Keppel charging beside him. Together, they race into the very teeth of the enemy's fire. Against all odds, the line breaks. The pirate host melts back into the emerald shadows of the interior, leaving their smoking strongholds behind. Brooke stands triumphant, but the war for the rivers is only beginning. With Keppel at his side and a mighty host of loyal Dayaks at his back, the Rajah prepares for a final reckoning. The time has come to break the pirate scourge forever. Let the fight begin. Welcome back to the Old World with Will Tanner. This is the podcast where we'll discuss the great men and families who made the Old World, from swashbuckling colonial adventurers to the great lordly families of America and Britain. This time, we'll be continuing our chronicle of the first White Rajah of Sarawak. When we left James Brooke back in 1842, he had just secured the official title of Rajah of Sarawak from the Sultan of Brunei. The title was his, the little Raj and its long-oppressed people were his. Sarawak was his. It was the culmination of a great dream, achieved in a few short years of immense effort in the bitter Bornean seas. But, as any king will tell you, a title is just ink on parchment until it's backed by steel. Sovereign is he who can enforce the laws, and decide which laws to enforce, whether the laws of the jungle or something more civilized. Brooke didn't inherit a peaceful European principality. This was no Marlborough getting Mindelheim. Brooke inherited a city on the mud, surrounded by a chaotic frontier, where the law of the jungle was the only law that mattered. Between 1842 and 1856, Brooke's life was a whirlwind, gunpowder, and diplomacy. This was the era where he would finally break the back of the pirate fleets that had long plagued Sarawak, outmaneuver the schemers in London, and attempt to build a government that actually served the people of Sarawak, Malays, Dayaks, Chinese emigres, and European adventurers alike. To do it, he would first have to crush the pirates, and to do that, our adventurer, backed entirely by his own resources up to this point, would need more than his own schooner, the Royalist. He would need the full might of the British Royal Navy, and he found the perfect instrument in the illustrious person of Henry Keppel, captain of the HMS Dido, and soon to be, alongside Brooke, a pirate hunter extraordinaire. To understand Brooke's wars of the 1840s, you have to understand the partnership between James Brooke and the Honorable Henry Keppel. Keppel wasn't some average naval bureaucrat waiting out his term of service. He was the son of the Earl of Albemarle, and unlike many of his blue-blooded compatriots, chose not to serve in the cavalry, but on the seas, much harder term of service, but also one with much higher potential rewards in those days. He was thus a man of high birth, and also high energy. He was short of stature, affectionately known as the Little Captain by those who got close to him, but he possessed a restless, aggressive spirit that matched Brooke's own indomitable drive for glory. The two great adventurers met in Singapore in early 1843. Keppel had recently arrived, in command of the HMS Dido, a fast 18-gun corvette perfect for fast sailing and clever fighting. Brooke, our newly minted Rajah, who was perhaps reeling from the magnitude of his new duties, was in Singapore to drum up support for his fledgling kingdom, which was then being strangled by the sea-raiding Dayaks. The chemistry between the two men was, by all accounts, instant. Brooke saw in Keppel a man who wouldn't be slowed down by the red tape of the non-interventionist government in London, which here in the earlies was still skeptical of foreign adventures. No, Keppel, Brooke knew, was a man who could be trusted to act, and act well. Keppel saw in Brooke an adventurer who could lead him to the kind of glory and profit that a naval officer dreams of. But why was Keppel so eager to help a man who was technically a private ruler of a foreign land and who had not been recognized by the British government back in Whitehall, even if this Singaporean outpost seemed to welcome him? It wasn't just a shared love of Jane Austen or aristocratic breeding. No, in the mid-19th century, the British Navy had a very specific incentive for hunting pirates: head money. Under the Piracy Act, the British government paid a bounty for every pirate captured or killed. For a captain and his crew, a successful expedition against a pirate fleet, such as those that plagued Sarawak, could mean a massive windfall, sometimes more than several years' worth of salary in a single afternoon for everyone aboard. When Brooke told Keppel that the rivers of Sarawak were teeming with thousands of pirates who needed to be stopped for good, Keppel didn't just see a humanitarian crisis, whatever his nobler impulses. He, like Brooke, saw a golden opportunity. 1843, the first strike at Sarabas. The soon-to-be legendary partnership was quickly put to the test, thanks to the Saribas Dayaks. These are the infamous Sea Dayaks, or Iban pirates, that we mentioned in the last episode. Bloody-minded and bent on rapine, the Ibans were the terror of the Sarawak coast. They operated out of the interior, using the winding, muddy rivers as a natural fortress. These weren't mere pirates, in the sense of petty thieves with a single ship and black flag. They were a maritime power that dominated the region, having wreaked havoc for as long as anyone could remember with their war prows, known as bengkongs. These massive vessels were often 90 feet long, carrying 100 warriors armed with every terrifying weapon under the sun, and bristling with brass cannons called lelas. Were you a merchant, a land Dayak, or a hapless traveler, seeing one of these prows on the horizon, let alone a fleet of them, was enough to make even a grown man quail in horror. Such is the pirate power Brooke and Keppel set out to destroy in June of 1843, when the Dido sailed for the Sarabas River. This was naval warfare like the British had rarely seen. Dense jungle and lurking enemies who might swarm in dozens of massive canoes at any moment were the threat, not a line abreast of mighty and proud warships. The Sarabas River up which they sailed was a labyrinth of mud and mangroves, a place where the water was the color of tea and the humid air pressed down upon their breathing hearts, while filling their raspy, adrenaline-fueled breaths. The Dido was too big to sail up the muddy, pirate-infested river, so it was Keppel's gig, the Dido's penance, that led the cobbled-together flotilla, with Brooke standing tall in the lead boat as the force advanced into unknown horrors. Then the oppressive silence of the deep jungle was shattered by the rhythmic thrum of the pirates' war gongs. Ahead, the pirates had prepared a lethal trap, a massive boom of ironwood logs lashed together with cables of rattan thick as a man's arm, stretching across the entire width of the river to trap Brooke's flotilla. Behind this barrier sat the pirate stockades, bristling with lelas, long-barreled brass cannons, that could thunder death down upon the pirate hunters. As Brooke's men came into range, the pirates lit the fuse on Armageddon in the stifling jungle, and the lelas angrily spat fire and grape shot, churning the water into a frothing white mess around the boom-obstructed boats. Keppel and Brooke, however, were not interested in a cautious exchange of fire, picking away at the enemy from behind the boom. They were there to end this enemy for good. The British sailors, with dreams of head money in mind, and adrenaline pulsing through their blood, charged upriver with a ferocious intensity that matched the pirates' own. Under a murderous hail of slugs and stones from the banks, the men leapt onto the logs with axes and cold chisels, hacking away at the rattan lashings with a desperate fury. Brooke's own native contingent, inspired by the Rajah's cool-headed presence, paddled their smaller vessels through the gaps in the unwieldy boom, engaging in a deadly game of cat and mouse with the pirate snipers hidden in the dense, overhanging canopy all along the stockade-encrusted banks. The battle was on. With a groaning snap, the boom finally gave way, and the flotilla surged through it. with the onrushing fury of a broken dam. Brooke was among the first of the flotilla's ragtag force to hit the muddy bank, a private English gentleman leading a charge of bayonets against the most feared maritime power in the archipelago. Nor did the sailors wait for orders. They stormed up the steep embankments of the Nanga Pade stockades, their steel flashing in the harsh tropical sun as they met the Sarabas warriors in a chaotic, hand-to-hand struggle. By the time the sun began to set, pillars of black smoke rose over the great forts. The pirates defeated in a major battle of wills. The defeated chiefs of Nanga Pade and Lingir Mali Lebu, the first vanquished foes of the great anti-pirate campaign, were brought aboard to Brooke's vessel and offered clear terms. Peace was theirs, on easy terms, if only they'd end the piracy and headhunting. But they wouldn't. Their belief system demanded heads, and they stood by it. They wouldn't pay the dear price he was demanding. And so the war had to continue. Following the victory at Pade, Brooke and Keppel turned their sights toward the Paku and Rimbus rivers, the remaining arteries of the Sarabas pirate power. But make no mistake, these engagements weren't merely mop-up operations. They were desperate, close-quarters struggles against an enemy who now knew exactly what the Rajah and the little captain were made of. The expedition first pushed into the Paku branch of the Saribas River, where the jungle canopy often met overhead, turning the waterway into a steaming green tunnel of muddy water, dense growth, and lurking danger. The resistance at Paku was led by the legendary Sheriff Muller, a pirate lord who viewed Brooke's presence and rule as a direct threat to his centuries-old monopoly on coastal raiding and dearly held practice of headhunting. He'd fight to the bitter end for both, and to do so, the pirates had fortified the river with a series of massive, overlapping stockades, each designed to catch the British boats in a horrible crossfire of brass layla fire and poisoned sumpit darts. But Brooke was not to be put off. Keppel was by his side. The charge went forth, the boats surged through the lead and dart-filled air, and the Dido's boats grounded on the muddy banks, the air thick with the scent of gunpowder and the deafening, pulsing beat of war gongs. Brooke again boldly charged forth and led his Malay and Dayak allies through the knee-deep muck, charging straight into the face of the batteries. The British sailors stayed right behind him, scrambling up the slippery slopes with their cutlasses and muskets. The fighting was savage. The pirates defended their wretched lairs with a ferocity born of desperation, but the combined weight of British discipline and the Rajah's charismatic leadership proved too much. One by one, the Paku forts were breached, and Sharif Muller was forced to flee into the trackless interior, leaving his destroyed strongholds as a testament to the new order. The anti-pirate campaign of this year, 1843, reached its thundering crescendo at the Rimbus River, the final sanctuary for the Sarabas chiefs. Here, at the stronghold of Rembas, the pirates had concentrated their remaining strength behind a formidable series of defenses. They believed the upper reaches of the Rimbus were unreachable for European-led forces, but Brooke and Keppel pushed their men to the limit, dragging the heavy boats over sandbars and through tangled debris that would have turned back a less determined force. The assault on Rimbus was a whirlwind of fire and steel, decided at the point of a bayonet. The pirates met the landing parties at the very edge of the stockades, engaging in a frantic hand-to-hand melee in which the Rajah himself was seen in the thick of the fray, his presence acting as a lightning rod for his native warriors. By the time the British flag was raised over the ruins of Rembas, the Sarabas pirate confederacy was shattered. Brooke had done more than win a battle. He had proven that he could dismantle a system of maritime terror that had gripped Sarawak for generations. If 1843 was a warning in which the pirates were defeated and told to stop headhunting, 1844 was the great reckoning in which Brooke faced down not just the pirate lords, but also his nemesis, Pengaran Indera Mahkota, the deposed governor of Sarawak, that you'll remember from Chapter 1 of this series. The Sea Dayaks, neighbors and rivals to the Sarabas, had not been cowed by the campaign of 1843. They continued to raid, and Brooke knew that if he didn't crush them, his authority in Sarawak would evaporate, much as Mahkota wanted. This time, Keppel returned with even more firepower, bringing along not just the Dido, but also the steamer, Felgathon. The sight of a steamship, a fire ship, that moved against the wind and tide sent shock waves through the native population that had never seen such a wonder. Their first target was Patusan, pirate stronghold protected by 5 massive forts and 60 pieces of cannon. The battle at Patusan was a rout. The steamer's mighty guns hammered the forts into splinters. The landing parties swept through the ruins. The Dayaks had been taught the full power of the Royal Navy. But the campaign of 1844 was not all easy victories led by the smoke-belching steamers. It also contained one of the most harrowing chapters in Brooke's military life, the disaster at Kengaran, Paris. After the fall of Patusan, the Rajah and Keppel decided to push deep into the heart of Skrang territory to finish the work. The river here grew treacherous, narrow, shallow, and choked with overhanging trees that felt like a closing trap. So it was to prove to be. The vanguard of the force was led by the legendary Datu Patinggi Ali, a Malay chief of unparalleled courage who would become one of Brooke's most loyal brothers in arms. Riding with him was Mr. Stewart, a daring volunteer from the Dido. Their excitement and adventure-tinted zeal to strike at the enemy, they pulled far ahead of the main body of the fleet, a place called Kengaran Paris, where the river narrows into a rocky reach. The trap finally snapped. Thousands of Iban pirate warriors, the mighty Skrang Sea Dayaks, had been waiting in the silence of the jungle. As Ali's small group of boats entered the shallow water, the pirates launched a massive, coordinated ambush. Hundreds of war prows surged from the hidden creeks, while a rain of spears, stones, and poisoned blow darts descended from the banks. It was a chaotic, bloody melee. Datu, Patinggi Ali, and Stewart were overwhelmed by sheer numbers, falling in their dozens in the thick of a desperate hand-to-hand struggle before the Rajah could bring up the main force. When Brooke finally arrived with the heavy guns of the steamer and the Dido's boats, they found the water stained red and the pirates exultant. It was a bitter blow for Brooke, who was close to Ali and deeply respected him. But Brooke could not and would not allow grief to paralyze him. He rallied his men for a final push, fighting the pirates back in a masterful counterattack that drove them into the mountains and proved that even a tragic setback would not stop the inevitable march of the Rajah's law. By 1845, Brooke's reputation as a pirate killer was established, but still all was not well and all was not secure. To the north of Brooke's little kingdom, a powerful Sharif named Usman had turned Manrundu Bay into a sanctuary for every renegade and slave trader in Borneo. And into his lands fled the Ibans, the headhunters, the enemies of civilization Brooke was desperately trying to fight. Usman mocked the Sultan of Brunei, openly challenged Brooke, claiming his forts were impregnable. Brooke was ready to fight. He joined forces with Admiral Cochrane in a massive fleet of 9 ships. The battle from Rudu Bay was the most conventional naval engagement of the period. The pirates had stretched a massive iron chain across the river, backed by a battery of heavy guns. For 50 minutes, the British boats sat in the water under a murderous fire, the sailors forced into literally using cold chisels to hack through the iron links, while the pirates' deadly shot whistled around them and crashed into their vessels. But, disciplined sailors that they were, they stayed in formation and kept attacking. Once the chain snapped, the result was inevitable. The Marines stormed the works, Sharif Usman was killed, and the pirate capital was razed. This victory did more than just clear a bay. It signaled that the entire island was now different. The old days of Sharif-led piracy were over. The White Rajah was now the undisputed power of the coast. While the wars were being won on the water, the murky and dangerous politics of Borneo continued behind the scenes, particularly in the dark and sultry halls of Brunei. The Sultan, a weak, vacillating man, was being manipulated by a pro-pirate faction led by Penguin Usap. In early 1846, this faction carried out a bloody purge of a coup, murdering Brooke's closest allies in the palace, including the noble Muda Hasim. Brooke had no patience for this horrid slaying of his loyal allies, and his response was as swift as his wrath was terrible. Once more, he led a naval force directly into the heart of Brunei, this time with ships of the Royal Navy at his back as he trained his cannons on the Sultan's palace. The Sultan, coward that he was, fled into the jungle as his city was occupied, and Brooke dictated terms. It was in this moment of total triumph that Brooke secured the cession of Labuan, a little island off the coast, thought to be rich in coal, thus useful to the Navy, as a coaling station for its new steamers. In fact, Brooke, ever the far-sighted ruler, who could play a poor hand to his immense advantage, saw the malarial, mosquito-riddled Labuan as a vital link, a British base that could provide a permanent naval presence to keep the pirates at bay, and, if it had the time, also to protect the trade routes to China. And so he demanded it of the Sultan, was granted it, and on December 24th, 1846, the Union Jack was raised over Labuan. This was to prove to Brooke's advantage. Not only was the island his, but he was subsequently appointed its first governor, as well as Her Majesty's commissioner to the Sultan of Brunei, which brought him a tidy salary and pushed him into the public eye yet further. It was in the afterglow of these victories, with scores of the defeated pirate flotillas crushed by his men, an island added to his kingdom, and the Sultan of Brunei cowering before the man who is now an official representative of Her Majesty the Queen, that the dashing hero, characteristic of the age, returned to England, where he was welcomed as the hero that he was in 1848, knighted by the Queen and celebrated as the English Rajah. The legend, romance, and splendor of his incredible victories and wonderful rule were never more alive than then. And it was shortly afterward, in 1849, that the pirate threat returned with a vengeance, and Brooke reached the peak of his military career. Despite their previous defeats, the Sarabas and Scrang pirates, those vaunted Ibans, made one last, desperate attempt to reclaim the sea from Brooke. They prepared to attack, assembling a massive great fleet of over 100 war prows, nearly 4,000 men. Brooke prepared to fight, rallied another flotilla, and intercepted them at the mouth of the Batang Maru River on the night of July 31st. He had with him the HMS Royalist, several smaller boats, and the iron steamer Nemesis. What followed was not a battle, but an annihilation delivered by superior technology. In the pitch black of night, the Nemesis drove straight through the pirate lines, her paddles crushing the smaller boats like eggshells, while her guns raked the larger ones with canister shot. The pirates were trapped between the steamer and the shore. By morning, the beach was littered with the wreckage of the great fleet. Over 500 pirates, perhaps many more, lay dead. It was the most lopsided victory in the history of the region, and it effectively ended large-scale piracy in northwest Borneo for a generation. Brooke was now not just a titular Rajah, a rising man, or a roguish adventurer with a flair for the romantic. He was a great man, the rakish, handsome, gentleman explorer who had ended an intractable problem. While the world saw the great warrior, people of Sarawak saw a ruler better than any they had known before. Between his expeditions, Brooke was building a state from scratch. Further, philosophy was revolutionary for the time. His philosophy. He believed Sarawak should be governed for the benefit of its inhabitants, not for a distant colonial office or shareholders. His rule would not be the cold, impersonal, extortionate rule of the East India Company, but the just and capable rule of a man who cared for his people. To do so most effectively, make sure the headhunting and piracy threat remained rooted out by keeping a close eye on the chiefs. Brooke established a council negri, where Malay datus and native chiefs sat alongside his few British officers to discuss the laws of the land. He didn't impose a complex British legal code that would confuse the natives, but rather simplified the existing customs, focusing on the eternal principle of justice. He lowered taxes, abolished the state monopoly on trade, and ensured that every man, from the wealthiest merchant to the poorest Dayak farmer, had the right to petition the Rajah directly. Many took him up on it, leading to lengthy public hearings under the scorching tropical sun. Further, Brooke attempted to stimulate the economic base of the war and piracy-ravaged country, encouraging the Chinese to settle and mine for antimony and gold in the rugged hills of Sarawak, recognizing them as the industrial engine of the state. He built forts at the mouths of the major rivers that did double duty as anti-piracy endeavors in trade centers and courts where local people could find protection and fair dealing. Under Brooke, Sarawak became a rare island of stability in a sea of chaos, and its prosperity rocketed upwards thanks to his efforts. However, the very success that made Brooke a hero in Borneo made him a target for the cynical armchair theorists in London, a group of radicals and liberals in Parliament, led by the relentless Joseph Hume, began a campaign to vilify the Rajah. They were horrified by the carnage at Batang Maru, but their most potent weapon wasn't more outrage. It was the ledger book. Hume and his cohort seized upon the head money bounties as proof that Brooke and Keppel weren't civilizers, but high seas mercenaries. They accused Brooke of using the British Navy to massacre what they called peaceful traders, simply to line his pockets and expand his personal kingdom. The financial centerpiece of their attack was the staggering payout claimed after the Battle of Batang Maru. For that single night of action, the naval forces involved were awarded a bounty of £20,000, 700 more. A claim that Hume used to bludgeon Brooke's reputation in the press. To put that figure in a modern context, the 1849 windfall would be worth approximately 4.1 million 2025 US dollars. Hume argued that such a massive incentive turned the Royal Navy into a bounty hunting service for a private citizen, painting a picture of Brooke as a man who traded innocent native lives for British gold. It was a vicious, calculated attempt to redefine a heroic victory as a predatory massacre, ignoring the years of terror the pirates had inflicted on the coast and the fact that Brooke had already spent the bulk of his own inheritance just to keep Sarawak afloat. It was also a lie, as the head money bounties were justly won and the pirates defeated. The pressure grew so great that in 1854, the British government appointed a commission of inquiry in Singapore to investigate the heroic Rajah over the fury of his loving supporters. It was a humiliating moment for Sir James, who had to stand trial and defend his life's work against men who had never seen a pirate row or heard a war gong. However, it also proved a wonderful opportunity for a man with a keen legal mind. The inquiry lasted for weeks, but the truth was undeniable. Witness after witness, merchants, sailors, native chiefs, testified that the Sarabas and Scrang were indeed pirates who had terrorized the coast for centuries. Those who slandered the Rajah were lying through their bitter teeth. The commission honorably cleared Brooke of all charges. But the victory was hollow. The British government, wary of the political fallout and frustrated with the situation at Labuan, began to distance itself. They stopped the head money payments and withdrew much of the Royal Navy support on which Brooke had relied. By 1856, James Brooke was a man transformed. He was no longer the youthful adventurer who had sailed into Kuching in 1839. He was a veteran ruler, battle-scarred, weary from the political infighting of London and the rigorous demands of ruling a tropical kingdom beset by pirates and headhunters. He had brought peace to the coast and built a government that the people loved. But he was feeling increasingly alone, by some accounts, increasingly suspicious. An intense fever from which he barely recovered brought countless natives who loved him and wished to tend him to his door, but also weakened him and left him a changed man. The court of inquiry added to his bitterness. He had succeeded as a private ruler where empires had failed, but his greatest challenges and his greatest betrayals were still to come. The heroic age was ending. The age of rebellion was about to begin. We'll cover that next time, the third and final episode. And what a story it is. Thank you for listening. Make sure to like and subscribe. I really appreciate you checking out this channel. I'd love to make sure you hear the future episodes. So thank you and bye.